Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the second shelf and to another recent reads on Sunday. Well, I say another, but I haven't done one of those in, I don't know, 2 or 3 months for some reason or other. But today I'm doing a recent reads on Sunday, which means for those of you who might not have been following me for the last 10 months, that I just talk about the books that I've read recently. Duh. And the first book I want to talk about is The Nest by Cynthia Dupree Sweeney, first published in 2016. It's a debut novel, and Cynthia Dupree Sweeney is a US American writer who lives in Los Angeles. The Nest was a best selling book back at the time when it was published. And I had it on my list, for sort of an easy summer read, and that's exactly what it is. It's set in New York, and it's about four siblings, or five, let me count: Melody, Beatrix, Jack, and Leo. Four siblings, and the nest, which is trust money that their father, who is deceased, put away for them to get at a certain point, I don't know, 10 years or something. And it was just a modest fund, but for some reason, the fund soared, and now it's really a substantial amount of money. So each sibling expects to get at least a couple of $100,000. The book opens when it turns out that there might not be any money because Leo, one of the siblings who just came out of rehab. He's a drug addict, or he was a drug addict, a recovering drug addict. And about a year and a half previously, he was in an accident driving his car, and there was a young woman next to him who was severely injured. So obviously he had to pay off that woman, don't want to give any spoilers, but that's where the money went. And then the story just tells us about the expectations that the other three siblings have, why they need the money. Jack, for instance, he's an antiques dealer, and he got into some shady business, and he needs the money, to pay back a debt. And then you have Melody, who wants to use the money for the college tuition for her children, and Beatrice, who was once a lauded short story writer, but couldn't quite get her novel to be completed, and she needs the money, to take a writer's retreat, as it were, and finally finish that book. Plot ensues from there. Like I said, it was just what I needed at the time. Something easy, something funny, entertaining. It's well written. I mean, it might not qualify, as highbrow literature, but who cares? It was funny, and it was entertaining, and I enjoyed it. The next book I read was quite the opposite in terms of, easygoing. And that was Eileen Miles's book, Chelsea Girls, which was first published in 1996. Eileen Miles is also a US American writer. I should say they, because Miles now uses the they pronoun. Even when the book was published in 1996, Miles still used she, but now Miles uses they. So I'm going to use they. So Miles was born in 1949, and they are art journalist, writer, activist. Miles published more than 10 books, but I've never read her. But I've known about Chelsea Girls being, a groundbreaking kind of feminist lesbian novel. I read this together with Dan from Weird Books Book Club, and we had a really good discussion about the book. Miles wrote the book between the mid-1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, but it's set as a more or less autobiographical work about Miles's upbringing in the 1950s and 60s and the coming of age of Miles, becoming an artist, discovering their sexuality, lesbian relationships, that kind of story. It's not told in a linear fashion. It's more almost like interconnected short stories, thematically organized. It's very well written, funny at times, but it's also jarring. I would say it's more an interesting book than I would call it an enjoyable book. I'm glad I finally read it because it definitely says something about the time that it is set in. So the end of the 1950s and 60s, when Eileen Miles grew up in a quite conservative setting, and then try to break free and become the artist that they wanted to become, and also very importantly discover discover their sexuality. But it also says something about the time that it was written in, the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, when the AIDS crisis started and the topic of sex and sexuality was in the foreground for many people, especially the gay community, the lesbian community. So I can understand, for instance, why sex and sexuality was such an important issue to write about at that time in that book. But like I said, it was interesting, but it was not something. I'm glad, I think I said that already, that I'm glad I read it. But if you ask me whether you like it, I don't know. I don't think I could say I liked it very much or I enjoyed it very much, but it was certainly interesting. So if you are more looking for something about the 1950s, 60s, becoming an artist, discovering your lesbian sexuality, the book might be something for you. But it is quite an intense and sometimes really difficult book to read. Next up is nonfiction, also a buddy read with Kathleen from Kathleen Ann, who has recently returned to BookTube. So if you don't know her, I will leave a link to her channel down below for you to check her out. And that also goes, of course, for Dan, the Weird Books Book Club, who is not making videos that often anymore, but his channel is certainly worth checking out. So anyway, together with Kathleen, I read The Red Parts by Maggie Nelson, published in 2007, I believe. But if it's not correct, the correct date, year is in the show notes. Maggie Nelson is a poet and nonfiction writer. She lives in San Francisco, and I've read a couple of her previous books, not the poetries, I have to shamefully to admit, but the nonfiction, The Argonauts, and her most recent book of nonfiction, Bluets. And I like her style. I don't get along always with everything, but I certainly like her style. The Red Parts is a true crime book about the murder of Jane Mixer in 1969, when Jane was 23, on her way from her college to visit her parents, and she was murdered on the way. That happened in Michigan at the same time as the co-ed killings, and there was a person arrested for these killings, John Norman Collins. He was convicted for the co-ed as the co-ed killer, and it was assumed that Jane Mixer's murder was also had to be attributed to him, but he was never convicted for that murder. So officially, Jane Mixer's murder remained unsolved. And I probably should have said right from the start that Jane Mixer is Maggie Nelson's aunt. Maggie Nelson wasn't born when the murder happened, so she never knew her aunt, but the story of the murder still informed much of her family's history. The book is about the fact that in 2004, more than 30 years after the murder, a man was arrested, Gary Leiterman, on the basis of new DNA evidence. So the book opens when this news comes to the family after they had, sort of put it to rest in a way as much as you can. And then Maggie Nelson talks about the detective who solved the case, about the trial, first seeing the accused, Gary Leiterman, who always denied his guilt, but he was convicted nevertheless, who now was, of course, a man in his 60s. It is a really, really well-written, interesting book. I'm not that big on true crime if it's sensationalist, but this book is not. It talks about the impact such a violent act has on a family, the trial as such, what it can do and what it can't do, what it does to the family to sit through the trial, for instance. But it also talks about the obsession that our society has with the murder of women, and how that ties into sort of sexist ideas about women. So it is quite an intellectual book, but it's also very pacey. I absolutely enjoyed it, and the discussion with Kathleen only enhanced my positive experience of the book. So if you are interested in true crime, but not in the, sensationalist kind of true crime book, then I can highly recommend Red Parts by Maggie Nelson. The next book I want to talk about is fiction again, and another debut. Talking German all of a sudden, another debut novel at that, and that is Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams, published in 2019. Candice Carty-Williams is a UK, an English writer from Jamaican descent. I think that's the right way of putting it. Her mother is Jamaican Indian and her father is Jamaican. I read this book for the BookTube prize for the quarterfinals, and yes, I know I never made a video about my ranking. I'm sorry about that. I just didn't get around to it, and I think now it's a bit too late because we are in the semifinals. But I will try to make a video of the semifinals ranking. Can't promise anything though. But I can tell you that Queenie was my number one of the 6 books that I read for the quarterfinals. I really thought it was a good book. It's about Queenie, a 25-year-old Jamaican English woman, a young professional. She works for a newspaper. She just had a very unpleasant breakup with her long-term white boyfriend. She struggles with work, but especially she struggles with being part of 2 cultures, feeling not belonging to either of them, struggling with work and with her, not so much with her sexuality in terms of whether she likes men or women. She likes men, but she has a tendency to go for the abusive relationship. I know that a lot of people who read Queenie, they hated the main character, and she is annoying. I mean, she is whining, she is self-destructing, she is not getting her act together. She does things on every page that as a reader you go, Queenie, don't do that. You know that it's not good for you, and then she does it anyway. But I really thought it was a well-told story about a woman on her path to self-destructing for various reasons that are explained in the course of the book, and how she tries to put herself out of this self-destructing circle that she is in. So I find it interesting and well written, and I didn't mind the fact that the main character was really, really obnoxious. But I can also see that this could bother you. So I would say, if you're interested in that kind of story written by a young writer, I should have said Candice Carty-Williams was born in 1989. So in my view, she's a very young writer. I can recommend it, but I also know that it's probably the main character and the obnoxiousness of the main character is probably not for everybody. So those were 4 books. I think 4. Yes, 4. I have trouble counting today. Those were 4 books that I've read recently in the course of last month, June. I will try to catch up with my recent reads over the next couple of weeks, because I read quite a few books that I think are interesting to talk about, and I have never gotten around to doing that. So I hope I will pick up the recent reads on Sundays from now on. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching. As always, I'm looking forward to your comments, especially if you read any of the books that I was talking about. And I'll see you all soon in the next one.